The scripture reading today is from the Quran 49:13. O humankind, we created you from a single pair of a male and female, and made you into nations and tribes, that you may know each other, not that you may despise each other. Verily, the most honored of you in the sight of God is the most righteous of you, and God has full knowledge and is well acquainted with all things. May God bless the reading from the Holy Book.
It's an honor and a pleasure to join you today. So we don't tell all of our alumni that they are our favorites. If any of you are parents, you can't admit who your favorite alumni or who your favorite child is. Although I try to get my mother with 6 children to always admit that I'm her favorite. But so far in the past few decades it hasn't worked, but certainly we are absolutely delighted, proud of, really feel like one of our gifts to the world are the pastors that we put in communities at Claremont School of Theology. And it's one of those gifts that we say it keeps on giving. And we have to keep giving as well. That's why I'm here as well today. It's a lifelong relationship. When you build a relationship with the seminary, it's one that continues to grow with you. So we consider my presence here is partly because of Reverend Dr. Pastor Anna, but also because of our commitment to being in the community. We believe that as an institution, we should be engaged and part of our community. If we're going to train people who serve God, God is really among the people, really. So our point of being here, my point of being here today, is to show that the academic pursuit and the study of religion are connected to community. And we are essentially accountable to communities. We're certainly accountable to God, but we are also accountable to communities. Today I was going to talk about my personal journey to peace. You have my bio, you can Google me, I'm easy to find, sadly. So, no, I guess it's a good thing in this day and age. But my personal journey to peace, I chose the scripture today, is really to indicate that people of faith and people of religion, whatever our tradition are, we can be people of peace. And not despite our religion, not because we push our religion aside, but because we go deeply into our tradition, we look at our tradition, we love our tradition. One of my mentors was Glenn Stassen, who taught at Fuller Theological Seminary, one of the founders of this area of thought called just peacemaking. And you know what he said? He said, you know, when I work with Christian communities and we want to talk about peacemaking, people try to push aside Jesus. People try to push aside their Christian understanding. And what he told me, he said, the gift of my tradition, of his tradition to him, was to thicken Jesus. So he said, let's thicken Jesus in peacemaking. And that allowed me and gave me permission to say, you know what? I'm a peacemaker because I'm a Muslim. And to have a counterpart who would say, I'm a peacemaker because I'm a Christian. So it wasn't that we pushed aside our traditions, it's that we went back into our religious traditions and said, how do we look at our holy scripture? How do we look at the stories of our own tradition? How do we look at the stories of the prophets that are shared by Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, of which Jesus is one? I have a brother whose name is Isa, Jesus, and his identical twin brother is named Musa, or Moses. So when they were born, the local newspaper said, Jesus and Moses born into the same family. They were born in Bloomington, Indiana. So it was a gift, but one of the things we find, the relationship between Islam and Christianity, we have a theological separation, and it's very important that we acknowledge the differences and understand the differences and honor the differences. Muslims have a deep love for Isa, we call him Prophet Isa, upon him be peace, as one of the prophets that are honored in our religious tradition. So what I was going to talk about today was my personal journey to peacemaking. I was born in the part of the world that is one of the most violent. I was born in Kashmir, in Srinagar. Along the border between India and Pakistan are several 100,000 military personnel over the last 40 to 50 years. So I come from a place which has one of the highest military to civilian ratios in the world. And when I went back, I wasn't able to go back until I was 15. I left when I was 3. My parents came to this country for education, and I've been blessed with the wonderful opportunities of education and diversity and pluralism. When I went back, I was struck by how sometimes when religion is weaponized, what happens? Whatever that tradition is, what happens when we begin to use religion as a weapon against each other? There's really no single tool of destruction or no single tool of peace that we can find in religion. Religion has the greatest potential for healing or the greatest potential for harm. Yeah. And that's why people utilize it. So part of my journey and my work was to say, how do I begin to think about using my tradition as a tool for peacemaking? So I encourage you to go back to your religious tradition and think about, how do I approach my religious tradition as a tool for peacemaking? So as I share my stories with you, it's not about me trying to convince you of my story, but for you to think about the tools that you have in your tradition to think about peacemaking. So I have 4 H's, although one of them is a W. So my students always say, you know, Professor Sayeed, you always say the best teacher makes us ask more questions. I say, that's true. And they always say, well, why are we paying you? We thought we were paying you for answers. So that's I'll leave it there. But for me, part of teaching, part of preaching, I also preach in my community. I teach at my mosque. I just finished teaching 2 lessons on the Quran and nature and peacemaking. One of the things that I found is, if I just tell people what to think, then I really haven't done anything. But if I encourage them and instigate a question, and they go back to their own tradition, back to their own heritage, back to their own culture, not just their religious tradition. We have such a diversity, racial, ethnic, and language diversity. All of us have different ways of talking about peace. So it could be that within your religious tradition, your Christian tradition, you have something about peacemaking. It could be in your village back home that the person who was the greatest peacemaker may have been the person who had the least education. Peacemaking doesn't come just from education. It comes from our capacity to be in the world and do what I call peace production. So I'm going to speak briefly today. I'm not trained as a pastor, so I actually will speak briefly about or a rabbi or an imam. So I'll talk briefly. One thing ordained religious clerics share across every tradition. They talk a lot once you give them the mic. Professors as well. So I own up to that. So I wanted to talk about 4 H's today. One of them is healing, wholeness, hope, and humility. You caught the W there, it was the second one. Yeah. So in my community and in my part of the world, we are also very wedded to poetry. So we're raised not just with the Quran, but we're raised with the poetry of people like Jalaluddin al-Rumi. Rumi, who's the most well-loved poet now in the United States. It's interesting because now people use him by text to text something to their boyfriend or girlfriend. So we are very poetic, and that's part of my work as a peacemaker, has been to introduce different texts into the formation of peacemakers. So healing. What from my tradition do I gather about healing? The Quran describes Prophet Muhammad as a mission. Prophet Muhammad's mission was to be rahmatan lil alameen, to be a mercy to all of humankind. That mercy, that forgiveness, that softness of the heart, it was the mission that ultimately was the prophetic mission for Prophet Muhammad. And the idea is that it wasn't just to be a mercy to my tradition, but to all of humankind. So when I think about how I engage in the world, I think, how am I a mercy to you? How am I a mercy to you? How do I practice mercy in small things so that when I am asked to give mercy, to give forgiveness for the difficult things, then I am ready? Because really the heart is literally a muscle, right? For those of us that are dealing with issues around our heart, the heart is a muscle. The muscle takes constant rejuvenation and practice. And if we don't practice it in small things with our children, with our partners, in our congregations, if we begin to harden our hearts, then when the big things come and we are asked for forgiveness and God asks us to forgive for something that is very difficult, our hearts are not ready. So how am I? This is a question I ask myself. How am I agent of too many H's? How am I an agent of healing in the world, not just for my community, but for all communities? And then another attribute of God, and the word Allah means the God. So I think it's important for people to know that the word that we use in Arabic is also the same word that actually Christian Arabs use, Allah. So the word Allah is not a different God. It's the same Abrahamic God. The God, as the Quran says, of Abraham, Isaac, Moses, Jesus, and all of them. We share that monotheistic God. So God describes God as saying, my mercy encompasses all things. So this idea of God's mercy, not just encompassing humans, this is actually what I was talking about in my mosque, but also encompassing all things, all creation. So other forms of creation are important as part of peacemaking. So when I began to look, as I was teaching in my community about the Quran and peacemaking, thinking about how are we engaging nature. So I heard that one of your goals of the church was around sustainability. Yeah. So part of peacemaking is not just me as human beings looking out for other humans. It's thinking about the resources on Earth, thinking about resources like in Flint, Michigan right now, of water, and how we utilize. The Quran tells us that on the day of judgment, the earth will be called a witness against humankind. And she will say to God, what have humans done to me? So whatever we're doing to the earth, she is part of this peacemaking process. If we leave her out of the equation, then ultimately there are forms of violence that happen when a city where people can't drink their own water, where children are suffering. And so the earth is part of our object of mercy and peacemaking, because ultimately the earth and human beings are interdependent. What happens to the earth happens to us. So I wanted to point that out. So healing. The second was wholeness. And one of the things that I think was most important, and the thing that religion and spirituality and faith bring, is to redefine strength. So I want you to take the arm of someone next to you, the hand of someone next to you. I'm going to do it with Reverend Anna. So someone take the hand of someone next to you, and I'm only going to give you one instruction. The way you win is by getting your hand onto the pew more than the other person. Ready? Set? Go.
Okay. I don't know. We're doing good.
All right, you guys got it?
Okay.
All right, let's stop. So, what did you do? What happened? Anyone in the audience, what happened? What was that? How many times were you able to touch your hand to the pew or the space?
Quite a few.
Quite a few. Why was that?
Just because.
Just because.
We're collaborative.
Collaborative, exactly.
Good work.
So if we define strength as my dominating over the other, what would have happened? What would have happened?
You wouldn't have touched.
We would have frozen, so we would have stagnated. Or if Reverend Anna's been working on her upper body strength, who knows under all those robes, having 3 children and I have 2 children running after them, you may be stronger. I have 2, you have 3, so maybe you were able to get stronger. But one wins and one loses.
Yeah.
And the problem is that we face as humanity is that our approach to strength is usually to dominate over another.
Yeah.
That has been the intervention that spirituality and religion and the prophets have brought throughout time. It's redefining strength. To say that strength is not domination, but compassion.
Yeah.
But compassion. That strength is through my capacity to communicate with Reverend Anna, to be collaborative, because it creates a community larger than just my self-interest. And what it does is, peace scholars have said the number one factor that is the glue between people is the recognition of interdependence. Not only are we interdependent on the earth, but this congregation, all the stories you shared about those prayers, you are an interdependent system with one another. You are an ecosystem of relationships. So one of the things religion and spirituality and God bring to the equation is this idea of strength as compassion. So another saying of Prophet Muhammad describing God is, my mercy takes precedence over my anger. So God's mercy takes precedence over the anger. And then we share this, and the Quran shares with the Jewish tradition this idea of if you have saved one life, it is as if you have saved all of humankind. So the idea of saving one life is all of humankind. And every human is all of humankind. There's another beautiful, so this idea of wholeness. How are we whole as human beings together? There's another tradition. In the Muslim tradition, we have the actual text, but we have the oral tradition of the Prophet, the traditions of Prophet Muhammad. So we can never just look at the Quran without also looking at the oral tradition. I think it's really important. It's very similar to the Jewish tradition, which has the text, and then also has oral traditions of that interpret and help us interpret the text. So we can't just take a verse of the Quran and not analyze it in multiple layers. One of the things that Prophet Muhammad in the oral tradition says, he says that the strong man is not one who wrestles well, but the strong one is one who controls anger. So what about Jesus' tradition, and where were the points in the tradition and the life of Jesus in which he redefined anger, or redefined strength, or said, instead of me dominating the other, there's some value to human life and interdependence. So I encourage you to go back to the story of not just the Bible, but the stories that you have of one of the most important religious figures of all time, and think about, what do I learn about strength? And I know you'll have stories going through your head. We think about the Good Samaritan. There are a lot of really good examples. One good thing about working at a Christian seminary is I've become very conversant with other religious traditions, and I've learned a lot of beauty in reflecting on how other traditions approach peacemaking. So it's been very, very powerful for me as well. So think about those stories. When you first look at them at the very surface layer, it's let's all be nice to one another. But one of the major mistakes, and I say this as someone who teaches in the area of interreligious education and theology, has been that we have taken, as scholars, and we have put peace up here, right? We have put peace we've made it abstract. And we have said, peace is out there. And I ask my students on the first day of class, I say, draw what peace is to you. Or I ask them, what does peace look like? What does it smell like? What does it sound like? Because one of the things we have to begin to do as people who have religious or faith orientation is take these beautiful concepts that are easy to sort of put out in the world and say, my religion is a religion of peace. But that's why those religions can be used for violence, because we have to be much more specific, courageous, and approach our traditions with much more depth, to be critical of the pieces and the histories where violence has happened, because every tradition has been used for violence. Acknowledge those and work to see how our traditions can help us become agents of peace. So the next one is hope. And I think about this a lot. I did a teaching in my community. I was one of the first women that was able to give Quranic commentary in Ramadan. And it was wonderful to be in that space. And one of the stories that I talked about was the story of Noah. To me, no other prophet, and the Quran says we make no difference between their messages, so their messages are all important to us. For me, one of the things that the story of Prophet Noah, or Nuh in our tradition, in the Muslim tradition, exhibited was this idea of hope. Here he was, the Quran tells us, and other traditions that share him as a prophet. The land was dry, nothing was going on, and he's telling people, knocking on their doors, a flood is coming. A flood is coming. You better build an ark. Think about how crazy people must have thought he was, right? Yeah. A flood is coming. Get 2 animals of every, all these things that he's saying. And here's this person, every great prophet of any religious tradition was always someone who exhibited the ethic of hope. They saw a future that was not in front of them, but imagined that future with such great passion that they were able to convince others. Think of the great leaders of our time. Dr. Martin Luther King. Think of Nelson Mandela. Think of Cesar Chavez. Think of so many of the great leaders around the world who are peacemakers. If someone would have told, if we heard Dr. King's speech about people sitting together in the same room, those people who were listening to the speech at that time, they would have said, that's not a possibility, and they did. But somehow, part of what hope is being irrationally committed to an alternative, compassionate view of the future. Hope is an irrational commitment to an alternative view of the future. You refuse to accept things as they are. So that is one of the beauties that, again, people are always looking at religion as the agent of violence. But most of the great leaders who have been peace leaders have been deeply committed to one tradition or to another. And they have used not just that tradition, but as Noah did, he was asking people, he wasn't offering them money. He didn't say, I have money to build an ark. He didn't say, I'm going to give you influence. Probably if you joined him and his tribe at that point, you would lose influence. Yeah. You would lose money. The early Christians were often those that were most maligned, right? In fact, that's a very common similarity with the earliest Muslims. They were at the fringes of society. They were the ones who were enslaved. They were the ones with the least power because they saw the injustice in society. So this ethic of hope is profoundly important. And the last thing that I wanted to say was this ethic of humility. And I think there's something to be said about being a leader who also consistently and constantly is able to receive criticism. To be a tyrant is to be surrounded by people who always agree with you. Yeah. If you are in a place where everyone agrees with you and no one gives you any critical feedback, you have, in the area of leadership studies, you have reached a point of toxic leadership. Yeah. And you know what's amazing is you've debilitated yourself from learning, but you have also created a scenario where you are not leading by inspiration, you are leading by domination. And more, we see that those who are perpetuating violence are people who have an inability to receive criticism, whether they receive it theologically, or whether they receive it individually, or whether they receive it socially. It's actually, you can take it down to the bully on the playground. Sometimes we talk about things at the level of countries. Yeah. Think about how we teach our children and how we are as children. If we're able to have a conversation and disagree, but be able to do it with civility, then we learn a lot. A lot of people say, well, you do conflict resolution. Does that mean you want conflict to go away? And I say, no. Imagine the world without conflict. It wouldn't be very fun, right? You wouldn't have disagreements. And that's what the verse in the Quran that I shared with you, God could have made all of us exactly the same. God could have made us the same color, the same religion, the same background. But I think God would have gotten bored too, right? He would have said, look at them, they're just getting along. That's you know, what fun is there in that? But the unfolding of the human story is the unfolding of our ability to engage conflict in ways that are creative, in ways that are peaceful, but in ways that really acknowledge difference. One of the things that I think is really important is not to think that I leave a particular conversation and put away my religious identity. Bring your full religious identity to the conversation because that's where we learn. Me coming here into this space and being able to share with you my beliefs, but also listening to what you have to say, listening to where you come from, acknowledging and hearing where there might be pain and difficulty, I think is also really important. And I was thinking about this a little earlier. One of the things we find is that there's this idea of what we call perspectival thinking or perspective taking. And it means that you're able to understand a situation from someone else's perspective. This is actually a developmental skill with young children. If young children can understand a situation from someone else's perspective, then that's part of the maturity process. So one of the reasons to engage difference is to understand, how do I look at a particular scenario from someone else's perspective? And so that's part of where we begin to build what we would call empathy. And to me, ultimately, if I see someone else as human and I accept someone else as human, then I'm not able to harm them. And if I have the humility to understand that their opinion, their human life is as equally important as mine, then I cannot harm them. To harm the other, we have to dehumanize the other. So whether it's based on race, whether it's based on class. The Quranic, the ayah, the verse that I gave you was also talking about gender. So created humankind from male and female. So all of these ideas of how do we approach someone who is different, preserve our differences, because I think the other problem with peace studies has said we should all agree on everything. Harmony is not unanimity. Harmony is not meaning we all share exactly. We have a beautiful choir here today, right? We have different tones that come into it. I'm not a music teacher. I wish I was. It's something I missed in life. But you have people coming with different voices, right? Baritone, alto, bass. That's for fishing. Yeah, exactly. So for those of you that are professional fishermen, there's another way that you could use. You could have an alternative. But this idea of when we come together, you're still preserving individual voices and strengths. So I encourage you in your own life, in your own tradition, in your own culture, and in your own history, to refuse the idea that humans are inevitably going to be always in violent conflict with one another. I believe in an alternative vision of humanity. And it's until we believe that peace is possible, until we believe that, if we don't, then we shut off the possibility for peace to actually be actualized. So this idea of healing, wholeness, hope, and humility. And for one of the things I wanted to end with humility is that the Quran says, "Do not turn your nose up at people, nor swagger around haughtily, for God has no love of arrogant boasters. Rather be modest in your bearing and moderate in your voice." This one, I used to love this when I was a little girl. "Truly, the ugliest of voices is the braying of the donkey." So if you know what that means to be yelling, and to be loud, and to be dominant. So one of the beautiful things of our religious traditions is one thing that they can help us do is think about how do we exhibit humility in an embodied form. Remember I talked about peace up here, out in the world? How do I exhibit peace when I'm talking to others? How do I not just practice mercy, but how do I do conflict prevention? So that when I walk into a room, I'm someone who brings peace to everyone that I'm with. And that is another wonderful attribute of all the great prophets, is that you read about how they handled conflict, and it was what they said. It was how they stood. It was how they spoke. It was to whom they spoke. Very often they spoke to those with the least power, or they brought into power those that were the most despised in society, right? And they put them next to them. They walked with them. So it's not just what we say, but it's what we do in our embodied form. How we pay attention to our children. There's a beautiful story, and I'll end with this. One of my friends told me she was watching TV, and she had her 2-year-old niece. And so she's watching TV on the side, and her niece is talking to her. Then her niece just came, turned her face, my friend's face, to the young girl's face, and just kept on talking. At 2 years old, this child realized, this woman is not giving me attention.
Right.
This woman is not paying attention to me. So how do we exhibit humility? Because what humility says is, you have enough value for me to learn. I have not learned enough. So one of the things our religious traditions do is to help us become embodied in our humility. And that is something I think any congregation can learn from. And so I thank you. One of the things I am so very thankful for is really, I think a lot of times, however Christianity is portrayed in the United States, I think one of the values I've been so appreciative of, I just became associate professor from assistant professor. And one of the things that I am incredibly thankful for is to learn about Christian hospitality and the value of hospitality. And one thing I was going to say, when you have a multicultural congregation, is maybe one of the values that people share, like when I'm going to Iowa next week to speak at a Christian college, and I talk about in the Midwest, it's casserole hospitality, right? Mm-hmm. What is it with putting everything in one dish? Yes. There's something about putting all the food in one dish. It's very interesting. So it's yummy with a whole stick of butter, and yes, exactly. But I think thinking about this idea of hospitality, and you have so many cultures in the room, what are the values that you share across Christianity from different parts of the world? And I think just being welcomed here, being able to speak here, I think sometimes hospitality takes courage too. It's not easy to bring in someone who's different. It's not easy at this time when there's so much being said about different religious traditions that's negative. So I just want to affirm that value and thank you for that, and that it means a lot because just in the last 6 weeks, my kids have asked me, they heard one person, my daughter said, if I leave the country, can I come back to the United States? Because there were things being said in the media about reducing Muslims coming to or my son asked me, I wrote about this recently, could he run for president of the United States? Because there are people saying that Muslims should not be allowed to be president of the United States. So to have this experience, they're actually in Sunday school at my mosque, or they would be with me, but I told my daughter, she said, you should go speak because I want you to get more awards. I was like, okay. I thought, okay, that's very interesting. I'm not sure what I'm doing for her. But for them to understand that Mama went to a church, spoke with the Christian community, and was valued and welcomed is an act of courage for me, but really more of an act of courage for this community. So I thank you for that, and it teaches me how spirituality and religion can be agents of peacemaking. Thank you. May God bless you all.
Thank you.
Now you see why I was excited. Yes. I have been looking forward to this since last year when I was thinking about, I had asked for Najeeba last year. They said, but President Kwan is coming. I said, well, next year. Next year I want Najeeba to come too, or to speak with us. And so I want to give y'all, were you touched by that?
Yes.
Yes. Did you really learn something in that?
Yes.
Would you give her a hand for their